I'm a nurse at a rehab center. It's Hell on Earth, Part 1. I've loved helping people my whole life. I'm sure after a few minutes of meeting me, you could have my personality nailed down almost instantly. When the time came to pick my career path, I was lucky enough to know exactly what I wanted to do. That was to work at Sombra Rehab Center. Anyone who lives in New England should know about Sombra and its owner, Constantine Sinclair. They're known as one of the most successful rehabs in the entire nation. With the opioid crisis in full swing, I felt like my calling was to help people who wanted to get clean. After 4 tough years of nursing school and a few rejections, I was hired to work at Sombra Rehab Center on my 3rd application attempt. I was overjoyed that I was finally about to complete my dream of working at Sombra. My parents were just as happy for me, and they even drove me there for my first day. Standing in front of the entrance, I turned to wave goodbye to them and finally entered the lobby. "Hello, are we checking in today?" The lady at the front desk asked me as I walked up with my suitcase and my carry bag. All the nurses who work at Sombra live on site, so I had packed all my essentials with me. "Oh no, I'm Cassandra Valois, the new nurse," I told her, setting my bag down on the floor to get some relief from how heavy it was. The receptionist looked at her computer momentarily, pursing her lips in thought as she looked around for my name. I took the moment to look around Sombra's lobby. I was taken aback by how beautiful it looked. Everything was ornate and so shiny. The waiting room chairs were made from expensive wood, and the cushions were embroidered with pretty designs. "Ah, yes, of course, there you are," the receptionist finally said. She stood up quickly and started gathering a few papers around her. "If you'll follow me, I'll take you to your quarters." I nodded at her, quickly picked up my heavy bag, and followed her as she led me to the metal doors separating the lobby from the rehab center proper. The hallways resembled the ones that I'd remembered from previous hospitals I'd been to, but there was just something soulless about them. It looked too corporate, like a hospital mixed with an office building. Just as quickly as we entered the hallways, the receptionist led me towards the employees-only section. She grabbed the name tag around her neck and held it up to a scanner on the side of the door. "You'll be getting one of these as soon as you're settled down, and Nurse Taylor has been to see you," she explained to me. I nodded quickly and followed her into the employees-only section. As opposed to the bleak hallways, our section was noticeably nicer and resembled the lobby more than the hallways had. It made me smile, thanking God I didn't have to stay in such a depressing setting. She at last led me to my room, which even had my name engraved into a plaque on the door itself. "Thank you so much," I told her as she smiled and nodded. She soon handed me the papers that she had been lugging around the whole time with her. She explained that it was just a few agreements and NDAs I had to sign to work here. I nodded and thanked her again as I entered my room. It was like a 5-star hotel room all to myself, with a queen-sized bed and even a mini fridge. I couldn't help but let out an excited little squeal to myself. I immediately started unpacking and placing everything where it needed to be. Once all my clothes and knickknacks were placed where they were supposed to be, I took the stack of papers the receptionist had given me and sat down on my bed to start reading them. Before I had even got one page done, I heard a knock at my door. I looked up to see a blonde woman in nurse's scrubs, with a blue butterfly necklace and matching butterfly earrings. She had a big loving smile on her face, with a pair of extra scrubs in her arms. "Ms. Valois, can I call you Cassie?" she asked me. I quickly nodded and allowed her into my room. I recognized head nurse Taylor Trent from my interview with her. She seemed like a bright ray of sunshine, and I had been so excited to work along with her. I tossed the papers to the side and smiled as she handed me my new scrubs. They even had my name stitched into them, along with my new ID badge. "Thank you so much," I told her with endless excitement bubbling up from inside me. She nodded and giggled a little. She looked around my room for a moment and then back down at me. "Oh, I hope I was allowed to decorate a little," I said, worried that she was about to say something about it, but she quickly shook her head. "Not to worry. I'm just getting an idea of who our new hire is. I know we had an interview, but this way I get to know you a little better. Makes it easier to manage you and all that," she said with a smile. I nodded quickly and looked back down at my scrubs, so excited to have them. "You don't start work until tomorrow, so after you've read over those papers and signed them, I'd suggest you walk around and get familiar with this place. It can be a maze sometimes if you aren't careful." She giggled, before waving goodbye to me and leaving me with my stack of papers to read. I tried my best to read through all of them, but they were filled with so much legal crap that it started to make my head hurt. And against my better judgment, I decided just to sign them all without a second thought. I set them aside to hand to Nurse Taylor when I started work tomorrow. As much as I wanted to wear my scrubs, it probably wasn't a good idea to wear them right out of the gate, since I didn't technically start working there until the next day. So I unclipped the ID badge from the scrubs and attached them to my regular clothes. I stepped out of my room and looked around the employees-only area. There was a break room in there with several nurses talking over the coffee machine. They spared a glance over at me, probably wondering what I was doing. But after seeing the badge pinned to my chest, they waved hello to me and continued with their gossip. I looked around some more until I came to an off-limits area with a large wooden door with a gold nameplate nailed into it. In bright letters was the name Constantine Sinclair. I stared at the door for a moment and felt a strong shiver go up my spine, like some force was questioning what the hell I was doing there. I quickly went on my way to get away from the impending sense of doom. Once I had familiarized myself with the nurses' areas, I exited the employees-only section and walked out into the rehab proper. Along with the mountain of paperwork I had received, there was also a helpful map stuffed together with all of them. Nurse Taylor hadn't been kidding when she had said this place was a maze. I probably would have gotten lost immediately if I hadn't brought the map. Most of the hallways were filled with patients' rooms, and most of them were closed at this time. Judging by the time and the schedule I'd taken a look at, it must have been free time, but I expected to see more patients out and about. Following my map, I ended up in the recreational room, where I did manage to find some patients, though they were much less lively than I would have liked to see. Most of them were standing around, completely out of it. They were almost like zombies, and the few who weren't were close to being like that. The ones sitting down and doing puzzles and board games moved with such lethargy that I thought they were insomniacs who hadn't slept in months. They unsettled me badly, and just as quickly as I entered the rec room, I quickly exited. "Watch out!" someone shouted at me as I exited the rec room. I quickly jumped out of the way as I saw a patient running full speed down the hallway past me. Following him was an army of orderlies and nurses. "Todd, get back here this minute." Nurse Taylor's voice echoed throughout the hallway as she and her army of nurses and orderlies ran after the patient. As she passed me, she suddenly stopped and quickly examined me. "Oh, Cassie, I see you took my suggestion," she panted, pushing a lock of her blonde hair back behind her ear. "As you can see, we have quite the unruly patient." She sighed deeply, trying to catch her breath as the other members of staff chased after the escaping patient. "Shouldn't we put out an alert that a patient's on the loose?" I asked, standing awkwardly next to her as she caught her breath. Judging by her expression, she didn't think of this as that big of a deal. "Oh, no, of course not. Todd is pretty harmless. He's just quite difficult to deal with at times." She sighed in annoyance. She cleared her throat again and plastered a smile on her face. "But not to worry. I'm sure he'll be caught in no time. In the meantime, please keep walking around and keep becoming familiar with the layout of Sombra." She patted me on the back and soon left at a brisk jog to catch up with the group chasing after Todd. I meanwhile kept trying to familiarize myself with the layout of Sombra. I'm not ashamed to admit that I got lost almost immediately when I tried walking through Sombra without the map I had brought with me. One area I did find in my frantic attempts to memorize the layout was the garden. It was in the middle of the giant Sombra complex and was a beautiful grassy area with trees and even a small veggie garden. I walked through the garden and sat on one of the benches to study the map again. After a few seconds of sitting there, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. Now I'll be the first to admit that many nurses have a nicotine addiction. When you are as stressed out as we constantly are, most of us turn to unhealthy ways of dealing with it. So at first, I thought that it was just a nurse sneaking a smoke break, but when I looked behind me toward the source of the smoke, I noticed that it was coming from a bush behind me. I poked my head through the bush and came face to face with a patient smoking a cigarette. And to my surprise, it was Todd. I had barely seen him as he ran past me, but it had been enough to recognize him, casually smoking a cigarette right in front of me. "Sup?" he asked as he looked at me without a care in the world. "You're the new nurse I ran past, right?" He puffed out a noxious fume of smoke at me, which sent me into a coughing fit. "If you're gonna tackle me and beat the crap out of me, can I at least finish my cigarette first? Why would I do any of that to you?" I was offended that he would even think I could do that to him. He squinted his eyes at me as he took a drag from his cigarette and then laughed at me. "Man, you're definitely new." He held his cigarette in his mouth and approached me, offering his hand for me to shake. "Todd, good to meet you, Nurse Cassandra." He paused to read my name tag. I took his hand and shook it. Not often I get to meet one of the nice nurses. "You can call me Cassie. Aren't they usually nice?" I asked him, which got a huge laugh from Todd, catching me off guard. He looked exhausted, not from running, but physically tired. He was gaunt, with heavy bags under his eyes and a buzzed haircut. There was a gash in his eyebrow which seemed fresh judging by the stitches still visible on the scar. "Man, you're a riot. Do me a favor, Cassie. Don't let that shithead Taylor get to you. She's a cunt with a capital C." He dropped his cigarette on the floor and crushed it with his feet. He wasn't wearing any shoes, only the grip sock patients usually wear. Before I could question him any further, he turned and walked back towards the entrance to the rehab and left me alone out in the garden. Once I finally returned inside and kept trying to familiarize myself with the layout, I finally turned in for the day. I swiped my name tag at the employee-only door and walked toward my bedroom, my head still spinning from trying to remember where everything was. I finally entered my room and collapsed into my bed with a loud and tired groan. Tomorrow was going to be my first real day, and I wanted to get as much sleep as I could. As I was about to, I figured I should at least change into my jammies. Sitting up in bed, I noticed that a sticky note had been left on my dresser mirror. I expected it to be a note from Nurse Taylor, but to my surprise, it was a small drawing. More specifically, a drawing of me. Despite how small it was, it had plenty of detail in it. It was beautiful, in fact. I looked around for any clue as to who had left it. I decided to ask around in the morning and stuck it back on my mirror. I changed into my jammies and finally collapsed into bed and passed out. I woke up with a jolt when the alarm I had set began to rattle and ring loudly. I quickly sat up and began to change into my scrubs. I quickly tied my hair into a ponytail and made sure my name tag was secured on my chest. As I looked myself over in the mirror, I was surprised to see yet another sticky note with a drawing on it. Taking it off the mirror, I examined it. A tired-looking man stared back at me, with a dark black splotch behind him with two white piercing eyes staring back at me. It looked almost like Mr. Sinclair. There were what looked like little letters accompanying the note, but it was completely illegible. I placed it back on my mirror and decided to check back on it when I wasn't in a rush. Making sure I had everything, I grabbed my signed papers, a clipboard, and my map and exited my room. All the other nurses were also waiting outside their rooms like we were in the military waiting to be examined or something. Nurse Taylor came down the hallway, followed after by a nervous-looking nurse. She walked and examined all the nurses, making sure we all looked spotless and even reprimanding a few of the girls who took a bit too long to exit their rooms. "Ah, Nurse Cassie," she said when she turned to look at me. I stood up as straight as I could and quickly presented her with the papers and NDAs I had signed. She smiled and took them, quickly handing them off to the nurse who was following her. "Seeing as you're new here, you're going to shadow me today. We'll start off with a quick visit to our therapy room." When she said this, several of the nurses let out gasps and began to whisper amongst themselves. Nurse Taylor stared at the other nurses and they all quickly shut up. "It's far too early for this much noise." A tired posh voice broke the enforced silence. All heads quickly turned down the hall towards the voice's source. To my shock and surprise, there was the owner of Somber Rehab Center himself, Constantine Sinclair. The exhaustion in his eyes made Todd look well-rested. It was then that I confirmed that the second drawing was indeed of Mr. Sinclair. "We're so sorry, sir. Just breaking in a new nurse," Nurse Taylor quickly told the blonde-haired man as he walked down the hall toward us, completely ignoring all the nurses around him. He walked with an umbrella at his side like a cane and had a cup of hot piping coffee in his other hand. He came to a stop and examined me like I was a piece of meat on a hook. "Humph," he grunted as he took a long sip of coffee. "Carry on, girls. Nurse Taylor, I take it that you'll be showing this girl around for the day?" he inquired, acting like I didn't exist and wasn't standing a few feet away from him. "That's correct, sir. I thought it best to show her the therapy room." She stood there looking up at him like a little puppy that was waiting for praise. If she was looking for any, she didn't get it. Sinclair simply grunted again. He stared at me with his exhausted eyes, and I felt like he wanted to crush me like a piece of rotten fruit. "Carry on, then. I need a smoke," he mumbled as he continued down the hall. I watched him leave and couldn't help but wonder if maybe he was just having a bad day. Having watched him in commercials promoting Somber Rehab Center, he always seemed so cheery and happy. With the surprise visit from Mr. Sinclair over with, all of us nurses dispersed and began to get our charts to begin the day. I meanwhile followed along with Nurse Taylor and her assistant nurse Emily. The two of them led me toward an area that I hadn't seen on the map. It wasn't even marked as an area at all on the map, and the only clue that it was a therapy room was the small little sign next to the two doors that led to it. I had thought that maybe it had been a storage room when I had originally passed by it. "So, Cassie, I assume that you read through all of the papers I gave you?" Nurse Taylor asked me as she came to a stop and swiped her name tag against the scanner on the door. She then looked over at me and let out a small giggle. "Judging by that look, I assume you didn't." "A lot of it went completely over my head," I admitted as I followed the two nurses into the therapy room. As soon as the doors closed and locked behind me, I got a chill up my spine. Something didn't feel right. In fact, something felt horrible. They led me toward a table in the middle of the room, and I let out a gasp when I saw who was lying on the table. "Oh, nice. You're making the newbie to this to me?" Todd asked with a dry chuckle. He was strapped down to the table, and despite his current circumstances, he didn't seem bothered at all. "Quiet, Todd," Taylor hissed as she walked over and slapped Todd across the face. I let out another gasp and quickly covered my mouth. "Now, Todd here is one of our more difficult patients, and as such, he's in constant need of therapy." She walked around the table and toward a machine that was set up on the wall near the table. "Why, you can't do that," I told her feebly, still completely caught off guard by the slap. Emily came over to me and began pulling me toward the table. When I tried to pull away from her, she gripped my wrist tightly and yanked me right up to Todd. You see, Cassie, here at Sombra, we do things a little differently, Taylor said with a smile as she flipped a few switches on the machine. It whirred to life and began to emit a low hum. We follow the treatments that Mr. Sinclair tells us to give to the patients. Heavy sedation, strict diet, and of course electroshock therapy. She held up 2 handles that had been connected to the machine. Why you can't do this? This is against our nursing oath. We promised to do no harm. I screamed at her. Taylor just continued to smile at me as she set the handles back down by the machine and pulled out the papers I had signed for her. And yet you agreed to our terms. She flashed the papers at me. She flipped through them and a sinister smile crept across her face. The contractee agrees that in the event of her inability to complete her assigned roles, her life and the life of her family are forfeit. She giggled as she closed the stack of papers. What? I asked in disbelief. Suddenly Nurse Emily placed the 2 wooden handles back into my hands. How had I missed that? What kind of place was this? Wasn't this Sombra Rehab Center? The greatest rehab center in the country? Now they were threatening me and my family if I didn't do as they said. You don't listen to them. They kill you and your family, Todd explained, letting out a tired sigh. Nurse Taylor walked over and quickly shoved a mouthguard in his mouth and motioned me to come over to her. I didn't want to move, but my family was in danger. I took a few shaky steps over to her and joined her side by Todd's head. Now, if you'd please administer the treatment, Nurse Cassandra? She asked me. I stared down at Todd and he nodded at me with a small wink. I felt tears stream down my cheeks as I lowered the handles and placed them against his temples. I closed my eyes as I pressed down on the buttons of the handles. Todd tensed up and let out a scream from behind his mouthguard. I backed up quickly and tossed the handles to the floor, shaking my head and screaming. This wasn't what I wanted at all. I wanted to help people, and here I was giving an innocent man an unnecessary electroshock therapy. Nurse Taylor came over and grabbed me by the face and held up a scalpel to my face. You pick those handles back up and administer another shock, or I gut you like a pig. Your choice. She ordered me, placing the cold metal instrument on my cheek and starting to apply pressure. I let out a whimper and carefully nodded. She let go of my face and stepped back. I walked back over to the handles and picked them up. I walked over to Todd, who had recovered from the first shock. I am so sorry. I whimpered again as I placed the handles back on his temples and pushed down on the buttons, giving him another shock. Tears streamed down my face as I stepped back from him, but I held onto the handles. Nurse Taylor nodded as she watched Todd squirm. That's enough for today. Nurse Cassandra, please take Todd back to his room, please, and then meet us in the lobby. Nurse Taylor said as she and Emily walked towards the exit to the therapy room, leaving me alone with Todd. I apologized profusely to him as I unstrapped him from the table and helped him sit up. He was groggy and mildly incoherent, so I carefully led him to a nearby wheelchair and carefully placed him down on it. I sighed and started pushing him out of the therapy room and out into the hall. Just as I did so, I was confronted by 2 orderlies who were wrestling a patient down to the floor. Let go of me, she screamed, before I could even raise a voice to object to what they were doing to her. There was a sickening crunch as they slammed her down to the floor and pressed their boots down onto her shoulder blade. She screamed so loudly I thought her vocal cords were going to rip. The orderlies wordlessly stuck her with a needle and lifted her body up onto one of their shoulders and began to walk away with her, leaving me staring in shock and in tears. Heh! Welcome to Sombra Rehab. Todd chuckled weakly from his wheelchair. The sounds of the female patient woke him up from his stupor. My room's at the far end of the hall over there. He pointed down the hall to our left, and I wordlessly pushed the wheelchair down the hall. What I wouldn't give to go back and stop my past self from signing those papers. Or at least getting to that point in the papers. I wish I could have never started working here, because from here a long, horrible trail of events would begin. That would ultimately ruin my life. Stay tuned and I might tell you all about it.